data checking. So thanks everyone for attending today webinar or podcast. And we have with us Nishant. Let me double go to your book. Nishant, I couldn't, how do you pronounce your last name?
Bajaria, the J is pronounced.
Yeah, Bajaria. Nishant Bajaria, and then Nishant is based in San Francisco. He used to work at Google, and then now he's worked at Uber. He's also author of the book called Privacy by Design by Manning Publication. There is a link in his book in our meetup page if you guys want to check it out. It's a very great topic for implementing the privacy at the large scale companies. And then again, today, Nishan want to talk about more how you can build the data governance and privacy in a more proactive way than reactive to avoid some damages and some of the liabilities that company might experience as a result of the negligence. So thanks again, Nishant. And then let me add you as a host, and then you'll lead the way.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Should I just introduce myself and start talking about the book then, or and open it up for questions? What's the typical format?
Which one? Sorry. Sorry.
So do I introduce myself and then wait for the questions to come in?
Like yeah, introduce yourself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my name is Nishant Bajaria. I have been an engineer. I've led technical teams for a long time. I've written code that's front end, back end. I've written code for Intel, WebMD, so pretty diverse companies. I was an engineer before at Nike and then moved into the product security and privacy space. I've led privacy and security teams at Netflix, at Nike, at Google, and currently I'm at Uber. And as Matt pointed out, I'm writing a book on privacy that is due out this July. It's called Privacy by Design. We are in the middle of renaming it to Privacy Engineering so that it more correctly reflects the actual content of the book, which is techniques for engineers to build tools that are better from a privacy perspective. The book is aimed directly at engineers, technical program managers, product managers who are extremely hands-on, who need to build things that are privacy safe. That's what the book is aimed for. I'm happy to answer questions, talk about the book, talk about the domain, whatever's on people's minds. So thank you for having me here, man.
Mm-hmm, sure. One thing is that I'm a little bit, you can go ahead because I'm trying to figure out where the item is for adding you, but you can go ahead because you don't need any presentation. Let me accept 2 more people are joining. Just a second. 1, 2. Okay, we have 2 more people joined right now. You can continue. You can explain. You can start the conversation.
Joining, yeah. Yeah. So the book goes into details about setting up a privacy program in which if you are a small company or a small engineer, you don't really know about programs. You basically focus on solving hands-on problems, right? You want to get into the data, you want to get into the systems, you want to delete data, you want to collect data more responsibly, you want to make sure that you don't have a breach. That's what a lot of what privacy engineering is about gets into. This book starts in chapter 1 with a lot of detail in terms of how does data collection work at a company? How do you collect large amounts of data? How do you work with unstructured databases? How do you work with Kafka pipelines? How do you work with data warehouses? How do you build out an entire end-to-end infrastructure that lets you collect a ton of data that then gets used by machine learners, data scientists, marketing, product management, etc. The book starts in with that. The book then explains how the volume of data grows in a company. How do you end up with an API gateway to multiple endpoints, to microservices, to the Kafka pipeline, to warehouses, to Elasticsearch, to third-party APIs? How does data promulgate and disseminate? The book talks about that through the lens of privacy. The book then talks about privacy and security. We have an upcoming chapter that I have not written yet, but it's in the middle of being conceived. I'll have it done by the end of next week on how do you use security tools from a privacy perspective? How do you build out things like protections for business email compromise? How do you prevent SQL injections? How do you make sure that data, access to data, identities are protected? We then talk about data categorization. One more person coming in. I'll just admit them right now.
Yeah. I'm going to leave. Sorry for cutting you. So I'm just your host right now, and everything should be fine. So I'm going to talk. Going to chat later. Thanks, Nishan. I'm going to upload this video later on tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
And for those of you on the channel, I'm happy to take questions as they come up. So please raise your hand or somehow indicate that you're interested in asking a question, because I can keep going until the question comes up. So just wanted to put that cue. I will not be offended if I'm also talking too fast and need me to slow down. Please indicate that. I will not be offended either. So with that being said, moving on to chapter 3, where I'll talk about what data classification looks like. How do you determine what you have and how do you rank that data based on risk? How do you decide that this is data that identifies somebody uniquely, that could be used for payments, that could be used for recognizing somebody's location, that might be used to identify somebody's gender, race, sexual orientation, what have you. So the third chapter talks technically in terms of how do you adjudicate the risk to an individual entity? How do you, as an engineer, work with an attorney to identify privacy risk and therefore categorize data? The fourth chapter talks about data sharing. How do you share data? How do you identify privacy risks? So there are proven industry techniques like k-anonymity, L-diversity. How do you make sure that in a given cohort, like what happened to Facebook in 2014, rather when it came out in 2018 with Cambridge, they shared a ton of data with a third-party vendor on the expectation that it would be used to identify people's preferences, but that data ended up being conjoined to a whole bunch of other friends' data, and therefore 58 million odd users' data got shared without their consent. How do you basically build out capability to identify privacy risk and data sharing in that regard? So there's a chapter on that. And I've talked about a real life scenario about President Trump when he was being tracked, not in a nefarious sort of way, but when somebody on a Secret Service detail had an app on their smartphone and that app was broadcasting location, you ended up with the situation where journalists working for the New York Times in Manhattan were tracking the president of the United States in real time while he was playing golf, while he was conducting business with the Prime Minister of Japan and what have you. So there's a chapter on data sharing and how you sufficiently anonymize and obfuscate data. That's another chapter. We have a chapter on data categorization and inventory. You can't really protect your data unless you tag data in a meaningful fashion. So when you want to locate your tax forms from 2017, 2018, you go to your folder, your cabinet at home, and you look for folders with the label taxes 2017 on it. And you know that because you built a label, you built a folder, you put all the 2017 taxes in there. Data is the same way. You have to locate data by first tagging it and then categorizing it, indexing it, and then affixing the classification I talked about onto the data. So the chapter talks about how you build out a Google type inventory of your data. There's chapters on privacy reviews, there's chapters on deletion, there's chapters on data export, there's one on collecting consent from users. There'll be another chapter on privacy policy, so engineers understand sort of why things are the way they are from a legal perspective. The goal behind this book overall is to take all these concepts and run with it as an engineer. If you are an engineer and work for a small business or a medium-sized company, you have no real concept of how privacy works, what it is that you're trying to protect, what you need to prevent, what you need to enable. This book gives you the business context, the legal context, and then the hands-on technical tools that you need from a privacy perspective. That's what this book is about. So the audience is like the folks on this call, but it comes at it not purely from a tech perspective. It comes from the perspective of what does an engineer need to know. So that's kind of where we're at right now. With that being said, I want to take a brief pause and see if there's any questions. Either pause and ask me now, or just put me a question on Zoom. So I'll take a brief pause and see what people have here. Okay, so I got a direct message question from someone that I'm going to just take a stab at and see if it elicits more questions. The first question that I have here is, what does privacy look like when it comes to overall security for data? And that's an interesting question because it's very hard to come up with a proper sense on the difference between security and privacy. But security comes at it through the lens of it's binary, like you are looking at the world from the outside, right? That's traditionally has been the world where we need to prevent a breach, we need to prevent data exfiltration, we need to prevent leakage of data, we need to prevent any sort of stealing of information, fraudulent credit cards, account takeovers, those sorts of things. And if any of those things happen, you have on your hands by definition a privacy risk, because anytime information goes out the door without your consent, it is going out the door without the consent of the engineer, the customers whose data it is. So a security risk by definition, for the most part, is a privacy risk. And if you have a privacy risk, it is also a security risk because you have somebody on the inside potentially, or somebody on the outside misusing data, having potentially gotten in correctly, but then they decided to overstay. So you have an engineer who accesses customer data for customer support or to build a product that is personalized to the customer, and then they end up leaving with that data. They end up stealing that data. They end up handling it incorrectly by putting it in a database that was unsecured, didn't have any encryption keys, didn't have any access control, didn't have any obfuscation techniques, any access logs, things like that. So you end up with this relationship where the closer security and privacy team works, the better, because you want to end up in a world where you are protecting your data and your platforms from internal misuse and external misuse as well. That's kind of the superset of the two use cases. So hopefully that answered that question, but if not, I'm happy to clarify further. Okay, I have a second question here that talks about how I first got into this domain and how should engineers look for these issues. I guess the question leans on something interesting, which is that most engineers do stuff from a security or privacy perspective when the attorneys tell them to do it. And that may initially be true, but that is a limited way of looking at things. So when I was an engineer back in the day, I was at WebMD and I was writing code for ETL code for the backend system. So the company used to sell healthcare software to companies, other companies that are enterprise businesses. So we sold to businesses that had more than 10,000 employees because those businesses traditionally provided benefits that scaled. So these would be healthcare rewards benefits. So if you finish your health assessment or you get your physical done, you get a reward program, you get a gift card, things like that. So I would traditionally get huge batch files from those. Excuse me, that's my dog going nuts. So we would get batch files from our corporate customers, and they would have the list of employees who had finished a specific task and therefore needed to get a gift card. And one evening when I was processing such a file, was late in the evening, and I have another question coming. That question from SS has been recognized. I will hold on and finish my answer first. So basically what happened was I got a file, which was a flat file with no column headings, completely unstructured data, and it had IP addresses, the email address, the consent for rewards, things like that. So I had all that information that was legitimate. Excuse me one second. But I also got information like SSNs and home addresses. Why that information was in the file, I'll never understand, but that information was in there. And I could have processed that file real time, given those employees their gift cards, and life would have been golden. But I could not store on our staging server a file that was unencrypted, not password protected, with information about other employees from other customers with their SSNs in there. So I wrote a macro to obfuscate with a regex detector to obfuscate any personal data in there. And then I put that file onto the SSIS processor, and then we put it on the staging server. So that was an example of how something that was a security risk became a privacy risk. And that's how I got into this domain. So that was how I got into this domain. The question here is, can you speak of well-adopted data classification privacy methodologies, for example, like CRISP DM? I'm happy to talk about those. What is interesting, the limitations of these methodologies, and I would love to hear from the person that asked this question, is that these classification techniques are very, very specific to the companies that you come in. So different companies collect different types of data. Some of them collect mobility data like my current employer does. Some of them collect search preference behavioral data like Google does. Some of them collect streaming data like Netflix does. Some of them collect retail shopping data like Nike and Amazon do. So what I've historically found is that existing methodologies can be somewhat limiting when it comes to classification. But I see as whoever you are lighting up. Do you want to chime in with context here? Okay, maybe not. So what I've traditionally done, I'll just kind of keep chiming forward, is if you're looking at, for example, location data, yeah. So what I see adopted most is I'm trying to see techniques like k-anonymity and diversity adopted the most. So what I see, for example, is when you are looking for location data, if I have a recognizability score that is very high. So if I'm in a cohort of 30 users and if I can still be picked out, that's a problem. I will still be recognized. So how do I obfuscate data? How do I make sure that I would take out maybe 2 or 3 decimal points from my GPS? If I have pickups and drop-offs, how do I get picked up not at 12:13 p.m., but at 12:15 p.m.? Like I would still be picked up at 12:13, but when it comes to recording the information, it rounds out to the closest 15th minute or the 0th minute or the 45th minute or things like that. So round up to the 15 minutes, which means I'm now going to be placed in a much bigger cohort and not be individually recognized. That's one example. So what I'm trying to do is come up with tiers of data where tier 1 is most sensitive, most recognizable, tier 2 is less recognizable, tier 3 is even less recognizable, and tier 4 is public. How do I get those tiers done? And how do I take data that is either individual, very granular, very recognizable, that goes to tier 1, which is high potency, high recognizable, high accuracy, but that's also a privacy risk. Versus in certain cohorts, I'll make copies of that data and place it into a much larger cohorts by adding perturbation, differential privacy, and then making it go into lower tiers. So those methodologies are the ones that I'm seeing. So it's a combination of obfuscation techniques. I'm looking at some aggregation techniques and then mapping it to tiers based on how recognizable individuals can be in that cohort. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. I've done this in 4 companies. I've yet to see a methodology applied super nuts that is off the shelf. I'll wait to see if there's any questions on the chat. I've had 3 questions so far, 2 directly to me, 1 public. So I'll see if there's any more questions. The other thing I talked about in my chapter in my book so far is privacy reviews. Whether you are engineers who write products or code for the business, or whether you are security or privacy engineers, one responsibility you will be placed with is reducing privacy risk for what is known as ERDs, that is engineering requirements documents, or PRDs, that is product requirements documents. How do you reduce privacy risk in each of these cases? And how do you set up a program? And as an engineer, you typically won't have the bandwidth to set up these programs because time is extremely finite. So how do you build out something that is scalable and unique? So what I have done historically in companies is you set up some sort of an ingest form. So when engineers write ERDs and PRDs, how do you get them to put information? So I ask them questions like, are you collecting personal data? Are you collecting XYZ kinds of data? Are you storing data in these data stores? Are you keeping data for more than a certain time period? Are you tying data to a specific customer? Are you tying data to a specific third-party vendor? So you ask those sorts of questions and you come up with a pre-screener form that lets authors and engineers answer that form in your domain. And then when they ask those questions, you can adjudicate what the privacy risk is going to be. So if you end up with a project that is, you give it a score. So I have a methodology that I talk about in the book that gives you a privacy score. So if the score is above a certain threshold, you assign a manual review that is a much more of a deep dive. If the score is somewhat medium, you do sort of a more of a sample-based approach where you check for the kinds of data, the volume of data, and then you either pass it or make some remediations. And if the score is super low, then as long as the retention periods are lower than a certain threshold or the amount of data is below a certain threshold, maybe you do a more automated approval process. So you come up with a scalable privacy review process that is much more responsive to your needs as a company, where it's either hyper involved, hyper aggressive, or it's much more hands off, purely dependent upon the amount of data you collect, the type of data you collect, the kind of risk you're willing to address, that sort of thing. So, okay. So I've been talking for a bit. I'll give it a couple of minutes and see if anybody has any more questions. I'd love to see if we could get a bit of an understanding of who's on the call. We have a few people on here. So am I talking to engineers? Am I talking to data scientists, people more on the legal compliance side? I'd love to understand, to the extent you all feel comfortable sharing information on what domain you come from. Okay, so more BI and data warehousing. I think on the data warehousing side is pretty interesting because a lot of the technologies we are talking about currently, like Hadoop and HDFS, and Hadoop has existed for a long time, but HDFS was primarily created with GDP with much more archival stage in mind. You had much more persistent append-only models, and GDPR was conceived well before that. So GDPR assumes complete data portability, limits interoperability, and things like that. So that's the bigger challenge. So I feel like a lot of the backend data warehouse storage would be kind of hard to scale. And I feel like for SS who asked the question, it's going to be interesting to see how much you can do in terms of identification and deletion once data exists versus optimizing for actual warehousing of data or an actual collecting of data in a more meaningful cadence. So that would be pretty interesting as well. So I would love to sort of hear from SS about what your experience has been. Is there anybody more on the legal, on the engineering side? I think this is more okay. Yeah, so I see there's a question, a lot of PII leakages. And it's interesting when people say PII leakages, uh, does PII leakages mean leakages outside the company, or does it mean it gets leaked across the company? Okay. So for SS, I would love to understand better what you mean by PII leakages. But the second question I have from Edward Yu is, okay, internally, really no great program. Yeah. So one of the things you have to do is pretty much invest in actual classification of data, invest in cataloging, build out sniffers, crawlers that get data from all of these different places, and then build out some ML models. Because remember, what you want is, you don't just want it from a security perspective, you also want it from the perspective of data hygiene, data governance. Even the people who do data science work have to invest in the invest in the capability to locate data and improve data quality, right? So the more you locate the data, the better. And there's a chapter in the book that does that. I'm going to add a link to the book, and I'm going to add a promo code. I have a 35% off promo code, so some of you might benefit from that. So hopefully, SS, you can get some learnings there. Edward has mentioned strategic tactical cybersecurity would be great. So I think that's an interesting observation, simply because even people who are on the legal side need to understand engineering a bit better. The way I look at it from a Venn diagram perspective is the least technical engineer should be roughly on the same level as some of the most technical attorneys. Like, you want to make sure that there's some overlap there. What you cannot do is attorneys who don't understand engineering and the engineers who are mercenaries and don't understand, the law at all. So part of the goal behind this book is to build a bridge between both of those windows, if you will. So I'm just going to search for the title, search for my promo code here real quick. Okay, let me do. Where is the, okay, here you go. So I'm going to put the codes in the Zoom chat window, and we will see there are 3 free promo codes, whichever one gets them first, and then there is a 35% discount code. So whoever gets to them first can process them. Okay, there's another question. Do you have any risk metrics that you provide and are previewed by CXOs? How do you make privacy built into the executive strategy? Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I look at things like there are multiple vectors here, like how many tables do you have in your warehouse? How many accounts do you have? How many of those tables are onboarded into your deletion platform? So I'm not sure how the chapter numbers are going to set out in the end, because we're still inserting chapters, we're still moving stuff around. It is still in the review phase right now. So in that use case, what I'm going for is, you might have metrics based on, number of tables deleted, number of tables in scope, the amount of data deleted, the percentage of data detected, the percentage of data that was deleted after it was ingressed and after last use. So how long did data stay in your system after it was last used? So if you have, for example, are collecting location data for Google Maps, you shouldn't be keeping that data much longer tied to somebody's identity while they are driving, after they are done driving, right? Because you don't need that data. They've finished their drive. They don't need to know where they were 10 minutes ago. Like, you might send them an archive for where they drove a year later or 3 months later, just to give them a summary of their history, but you don't need to keep that granular data tied to them directly. So how long did you keep that data? How many people accessed it? Those metrics are very helpful. When it comes to your privacy program, how many ERDs or PRDs did you get? How many were ranked very sensitive versus medium sensitive versus low sensitive? Over time, you want to make sure that the number of high sensitive ERDs decreases, because hopefully your data categorization is better, your training is better. You also want to reduce your response time, you want to reduce your remediation time. So those sorts of metrics really help. Hopefully, hopefully that helps you a little bit as well. And Mike mentions that there are probably mercenaries of each law and engineering. Yeah. And that's becoming really interesting, because more and more we're seeing that engineers are coming into privacy from different vectors. They're coming in from data science, from security, from compliance, also from marketing as well, or product managers, because this is a domain that's fairly easy to get into at the entry level, and there's a ton of great jobs. Because what you have is, if you do data management, if you understand Hadoop, if you understand Kafka, if you understand API development, microservice development, privacy engineering is pretty easy to get into, because all you need is the ability to build backend coding or even be a front-end engineer. And there's a ton of different tools you can build. If you want to build more strategic programs and actually make a measurable impact on risk, that's when it gets a little harder to climb the ladder. But in terms of coding, this is as applicable to individual engineers as any other domain. Question from SS. My understanding was that the car sharing companies keep that data for entirety, but archive it or push it into data metrics that are only available for a select few. Yeah, I mean, that's not completely applicable across the board, but in general, you want to make sure that as long as data is sufficiently anonymized, so which is why for this group, I would look into this technique called K anonymity. So K dash anonymity, and I'll write that down here. The second one is L diversity. So if you talk about these two, as long as you can anonymize the data sufficiently, you can store that data for a longer period of time. Of course, you want to check with your legal team, you want to check with the security team to make sure that the data does not identify somebody, because what you want to do is you want to keep this data for longer to build better products, to benefit your users, to get business insights, to beat your competitors, things like that. You want to do that. But what if that data does have privacy risk still, to SS's point? And what if that data gets misused or breached or exfiltrated somehow? That's a risk, right? So you want to make sure that you have a sufficient level of anonymity to the data. And these techniques provide you a measurable way to reduce privacy risk. That's pretty significant. And I know Mike said it's like 30 or 40 minutes. I don't want to keep somebody past their dinner because I know it's like evening during the DC spring cherry blossom season. So yes, there is a plan to have a chapter on differential privacy, but I also want to set some expectations because differential privacy could be a book unto itself. The data sharing chapter covers a lot of differential privacy in terms of fundamentally altering the data by adding noise and perturbation to the data. So the answer is yes. Maybe not as much detail as would be if you had a whole book dedicated to it, but yes, Edward, the question is, does the book tackle differential privacy? The answer is yes. I'm thinking about adding a chapter, but it all depends upon how big the book gets because there is an upper limit to how many pages we are talking about. Question from SS. It's more of a comment. I always found it interesting that companies release data that for Kaggles and such, de-anonymized, but I wonder how much can be converted to non-anonymous data. You know, it's impossible to be completely certain about how much data can be reverse engineered, but you really want to put data through the process of anonymization, obfuscation, aggregation to avoid that risk. And you know, you typically find out internally, right? If there is a possibility that this data could be de-anonymized, you will find somebody on the inside who can do that, right? So you really want to check that all the way through, and you want to. And the challenge here is the way to check that is to put it to task internally, and the more you put it to task internally, the more you increase access. So it's a bit like the way you minimize access to data is by increasing access to the data. It's kind of weird, right? So, but you have to go through that process, and the select few in the end of SS's comment is critical, and you want to make sure that you don't increase access all the way through, but you do it in order to measure privacy risk. Any more questions? This has been a great talk. Happy to take more questions. Okay. Question. Have you worked with US federal government agencies, and do you see any new PI related methodologies? I have not worked for a US federal government agency. I'm a naturalized citizen, so sometimes it feels like I have because they took so much of my data, the government did, to naturalize me, and that was saying no was not an option. Like there was no opt-out, do not sell mechanism available to me. The federal government said, give us all your data or we don't naturalize you. That's not directly what they said, but that's how it worked out. But my experience in working with regulatory bodies, not in my current job, but elsewhere, has been that it is extremely difficult to come up with a mechanism that works for them, simply because the amount of data that ingresses into government agencies is pretty high. And I talk about this in my book. There's a ton of examples where government agencies were taken up by ransomware. You had, for example, the US Border Patrol get breached one time, and you had license plates and car details and VIN numbers of folks get exfiltrated. So the idea that the government agencies of the world have clear answers to data security or data privacy is kind of fallacious. It makes us feel comfortable. But I have wondered on more than one occasion what happens when Baltimore as well. That is correct. Louis, there was I think New Orleans got ransomware as well. So, and a lot of these stories we don't even hear about because nobody wants to come outside and say that, hey, we were victims of ransomware. And I feel like, but the best example I have is Target. When they were breached, they were PCI compliant. And of course, the PCI Council then went back and withdrew the PCI accreditation. So how, and then they can claim that nobody ever gets breached under PCI. That's factually not true either. So it's a complex world where, which is why my book leans heavily on building internal techniques where you can look at your data, you can look at your techniques and actually build out something that works for your organization, rather than depending upon a third-party tool or depending upon a government standard to bail you out. I was part of the international standards body that wrote ISO 27701. So we tried to be in a combination of prescriptive and descriptive without being overly restrictive, if you will. But we did try to take a stab at that, but I don't think there is a standard that's a full get out of jail card. There is a question from Edward Yu at 3:40 p.m. about PIA and DPIA. So I talk about PIA and DPIA somewhat separately because um, at the end of the day, they have different provenances. There are some differences in them. But what I'm trying to do is understand exactly what the DPIA covers and what a PIA covers, because there is the ability to add technical privacy reviews on top of that and make sure that you have a more complete PIA and DPIA done, simply because you have at this point the ability to come up with a more complete privacy review process, which is you have a privacy review process that is legal driven, which is the PIA and the DPIA, and then you have a much more engineering privacy review process that checks for access control, that checks for encryption, that checks at the endpoint level, that checks for data mobility between data centers and data centers, or data centers and cloud instances, things like that, right? So there are certain things that come under PIA, some things under DPIA, and some things under the technical privacy review. And I like to talk about all three of them, because then you can talk about coverage, you can talk about the flow of information in the company, you can talk about who checks for what, ownership, and things like that. So that's kind of why I break it out a little bit more. Question from SS, what are privacy certifications that you feel do a great job? Honestly, I don't have any privacy certifications myself. There are people who take my courses on LinkedIn, and I teach a bunch of courses on privacy on LinkedIn. I also teach courses on career management and inclusive tech. So I teach courses on 3 different domains. There are people who tell me that they have taken my courses and those courses were very helpful in getting privacy certifications, but I don't have certifications myself. I think the IAPP certifications can be very helpful. They can be very useful in terms of helping you build out language and context and just conceptual understanding so as to get into the domain. I do think that they represent a starting point. They represent a stepping stone rather than a capstone. So whether it's a CIPP, CIPT, they're all instructive, and I'd recommend them. I just wouldn't think that they are the be all and end all. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, what do you think of Privacy by Design by Ann Kawukian, which is the foundational principles, or Yap Wapman, hopefully I got his name right, 8 privacy design strategies. I've looked at them both. They're all extremely great. And it's interesting that these perspectives were written for their time. I always think of them as starting point as well. I do love the detail these authors have gone into. I do love the fact that they bring a combination of actual data as well as hands-on experience, as well as contextual understanding. So I love the aggregated factor. My goal behind my book is to, and that's part of why I'm renaming the book a little bit, because privacy by design is somewhat of an overused term. We did that. We use that title mainly to get an understanding of how the book would resonate. It has resonated well, but I feel the title needs to be, I do agree, by the way, from a recommendation perspective, there is a mix of pragmatism and abstract. I'm obviously not going to be critical of somebody else's book on a forum for my own book, because someday there's going to be a forum where people would talk about my book. So I'll leave the subjective assessments to others. But when I was coming up in the field, I read Michelle Finner-Dennedy's book, The Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. I read Dr. Kawukian's book. I also read the 8 Privacy Design Strategies book. Those were all very helpful. Question from SS, what are your thoughts on open policy agent framework and embedding infrastructure security into code as it is designed? I have not seen large scale adoption yet, but I do see massive potential for adoption, because otherwise the domain doesn't scale. Otherwise you end up with a situation where you simply cannot track data. You simply cannot track applications. You simply cannot build out lineage. You simply cannot address the problem of shadow IT. So building security into cloud and the front end, that is extremely critical, because otherwise you end up in a situation where you have to build DLP, you have to build CASB, you have to watch for man-in-the-middle attacks, you have to, have massive amounts of encryption, you have to deal with their encryption at rest and motion, you decide what's a public network. There's a lot of complexity. So building out the framework into the code, into the infrastructure is pretty critical, because my book talks a lot about building privacy security into the data, but building it into the code and infrastructure is just as important. And the thing is, it's easy to build it on rather than bolting it on, because if you're bolting it on, you are depending upon adoption after the fact. But if you build it on, you're talking about making it part of the actual use case from the get-go. How did you phrase the decreased risk part by opening access to data? I wasn't following. Yes, I was being a little snarky. What I was saying is, there was a question earlier about how do you make sure that data cannot be re-identified, right? So what I was saying is, before I would share data with external third parties, I would open up that data to internal machine learners, designers, scientists, etc., and see what does identification look like? Because by my calculations, identification risk is sufficiently low. So what I was saying is, the only way to reduce risk of data is by reduce risk of overly permissive access control is by increasing access to data. So it's like counterintuitive, but more seriously, what I was doing is to reduce the danger of somebody on the outside accessing the data. I would have to increase the access of data among good actors internally. So, but if I'm looking for a bumper sticker slogan, I'm going for reduce access control risk by increasing access control. That was kind of my lame attempt at humor. Question from SS: what service companies are out there best securing the cloud? For example, who would you go to if you had AWS as a client and you wanted to work with the best security framework company? So much of it depends upon your context, upon your use case. I've used several of them. I'm going to hesitate to use specific names simply because it gets, I don't know when this is going to get put online, because I remember I wrote a blog last spring about how much I enjoyed Governor Andrew Cuomo's broadcasts about COVID and how I found it educational. And then it turned out that New York was not being upfront about deaths in nursing homes. So I hate to say something that will not wear well with the passage of time. So, but my recommendation would be having a combination of application security, platform security, incident response, privacy engineering, and legal band together and look at the lineage of data, look at the flow of infrastructure, look at the connection of endpoints, look at the combination of microservices, and then understand the egress of data from warehouses via third-party APIs. Then coming up with a vendor that assesses cloud security from that lens would be great. Because the danger sometimes is that a lot of people buy tools and cloud security privacy vendors without understanding the domain, because companies typically buy these tools when they have a ton of money or when they have a ton of risk or when they have a ton of audits, right? There's always excess of something. And that is usually not a good reason to buy something. It's like going to Costco or a big supermarket and buying food when you're hungry. You'll buy a lot of stuff, but they won't be the right things. You'll buy things right, but you won't buy the right things. So my recommendation would be to have an ongoing understanding of your risk, your enterprise risk, your API risk, your infrastructure risk, your data risk, and having these 5 folks work together, understanding the overall vector of your business, and then coming up with a list of vendors. When working with companies in the US, do you look for GDPR or CCPA or other regulation? My general metric for my team is you look at security and privacy regulation as a floor, not a ceiling. Because remember, GDPR is not prescriptive. CCPA is a little more so, but they are both embryonic laws. The challenge is both these laws are going to become the bulwark, if you will, or the beacon for future laws. Because when you have, just like a lot of textbooks, to my knowledge, are published in the state of Texas, and therefore the state of Texas has a significant say in how our kids study when they go to school. The laws coming out of Brussels and the laws coming out of Sacramento have a significant say in how privacy and security legislation takes shape, right? So I would hew closely to GDPR and CCPA, but I would use them as a starting point. So I would look at them in terms of how indicative are they of customer trust? What are regulators looking about? Like I was actually at a privacy conference, a security conference in the Brussels area in January 2020, when we were traveling back in the day. It was a CPDP conference, and the CTO of the city of Amsterdam, and by the way, how cool is it that the city of Amsterdam has a CTO, said that we are now judging, when I say we, they are judging companies not based on their responsiveness to a breach, but based on their preparation to prevent a breach. So how do you make sure that security and privacy risk is low all the way through? So I would use these laws as a starting point. but those laws are not nearly enough when it comes to the engineering guidance that a group like this would need to protect customers. So that was a great question, by the way. So we're down to the last 9 minutes. This has been a great conversation. 40 minutes have just flown by. Any more questions? I'm happy to take a brief pause and see if people think of more questions.